Hold on. Don't give up now. You may be standing at the edge of a miracle and not even know it. You may be inches away from the breakthrough your heart has longed for. You may be one prayer, one step, one moment away from the answer that will change everything. I know it's been hard. I know you've cried when no one saw. I know you've wrestled with doubts in the silence of the night, wondering if God has forgotten you. But listen to me, He has not. He sees you, He knows your pain, and His timing is perfect. There are moments in life when we feel like time is running out. We look around and see others moving forward, achieving their dreams, stepping into new seasons, while we remain stuck, waiting, wondering when it will be our turn. The waiting can be painful. It can make us question everything, our decisions, our faith, even God's love for us. We pray, we hope, we believe, but when the answer doesn't come in the way or the time we expect, doubt begins to creep in. God, do you see me? Have you forgotten me? Am I wasting my time believing for something that may never happen? These thoughts are real, and if you have ever wrestled with them, you are not alone. But here's the truth that we must hold on to. God's timing is always perfect. Even when it seems like nothing is happening, God is at work. He is never late, never behind schedule, never surprised by the circumstances of our lives. What may look like a delay to us is in reality divine precision. We live in a world that craves instant results, where waiting is seen as wasted time. But God does not operate according to human clocks. He is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. He sees the entire picture, while we only see a small fragment. His plans for us are not limited by our deadlines, nor are they dictated by our impatience. He knows exactly when to open the door, when to answer the prayer, and when to bring the breakthrough we have been waiting for. Throughout Scripture, we see God's perfect timing in action. Think about Joseph. God gave him a dream of greatness, a vision of leadership, yet his journey to that promise was anything but immediate. He was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused and imprisoned. Year after year, it seemed like his life was moving in the opposite direction of the promise. If Joseph had looked at his circumstances alone, he might have thought that God had forgotten him. But God was not absent. He was working behind the scenes, positioning Joseph for the exact moment when he would rise to power. And when the time was right, in a single day, Joseph went from the prison to the palace. If God had answered his prayers too soon, Joseph would not have been ready for the responsibility. The waiting was not a punishment, it was preparation. Abraham and Sarah also had to learn to trust God's timing. God promised them a son, but years passed and nothing happened. They grew impatient, and in their frustration, they tried to force the promise by having a child through Hagar. But that was not God's perfect plan. When the appointed time came, despite all human logic, Sarah conceived and gave birth to Isaac, the child of promise. The delay was not a mistake. It was part of God's design. When Isaac was finally born, it was undeniable that it was God's doing, not human effort. We see the same truth in the life of Jesus. When his friend Lazarus was sick, Mary and Martha sent word, expecting Jesus to come immediately, but he waited. By the time he arrived, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. The people thought it was too late. But Jesus knew what he was doing. Had he arrived earlier, he would have healed a sick man. Instead, he raised a dead man. His timing allowed for a greater miracle, one that revealed God's glory in a way no one could have expected. What looks like a delay to us is never a delay to God. He is orchestrating things in ways we cannot see, aligning circumstances beyond our understanding. Sometimes the waiting is for our protection. Other times, it's for the sake of others who will be impacted by our testimony. There are doors that remain closed because we are not ready to walk through them yet. There are prayers that seem unanswered because the answer would not be a blessing if given too soon. There are dreams that take time to unfold because God is still preparing the stage for his perfect plan. It is not easy to wait, especially when we do not understand why things are taking so long. The enemy will use these moments to plant seeds of discouragement, to make us question God's faithfulness. He wants us to doubt, to give up, to believe that we have been forgotten. But faith is trusting that even when we cannot see the full picture, God is still working. It is believing that just as the sun rises at the appointed time, God's promises will come to pass in the perfect season. The Bible tells us in Isaiah 55:8-9, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." This means that even when things don't make sense to us, they make perfect sense to God. He is weaving together a plan that is far beyond our comprehension. He is not only working for our good, but for the good of those around us. Think about the seasons of life. No matter how much we want summer to come in the middle of winter, we cannot force it. The trees do not rush their growth. The flowers do not bloom before their time. There is an appointed season for everything, and when that season arrives, everything happens as it should. In the same way, our lives unfold according to God's divine timing. If we try to rush the process, we may end up with something incomplete. But if we trust in His timing, we will receive the fullness of His blessing. Waiting is not a sign of God's absence. It is a sign of His perfect plan at work. He knows what He is doing. The doors that seem closed now will open at the right moment. The prayers that feel unanswered will be fulfilled in ways greater than we imagined. The dreams that seem distant will become reality in the appointed season. We do not have to worry, we do not have to fear, and we do not have to doubt. All we have to do is trust, believe, and hold on, because when God moves, everything will change in an instant. Waiting is one of the hardest things we will ever have to do in life. It is in the waiting that we wrestle with doubt, with fear, and with the temptation to take matters into our own hands. When the answers seem delayed, when the doors remain shut, when the silence stretches on longer than we expected, we begin to ask questions. God, why is this taking so long? Have you forgotten me? Did I hear you wrong? Am I wasting my time believing for something that will never come? These are the struggles of the waiting season. And yet, what we often fail to realize is that the waiting is not just about the delay. It is about the preparation. God never wastes time. Every moment we spend in the waiting season is a moment He is using to shape us, strengthen us, and prepare us for what is coming. We may not see it, we may not feel it, but God is working behind the scenes in ways we cannot imagine. His timing is perfect, and if He is making us wait, it is because He is doing something in us that must be completed before we step into the next season. It is not just about receiving the blessing, it is about becoming the person who is ready to carry it. Joseph had a dream from God as a young man, a dream that one day he would be in a position of great authority. But instead of stepping directly into his destiny, he found himself on a long and painful journey, betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. Year after year, he waited, not knowing when or if his situation would ever change. But what Joseph could not see in the moment was that God was preparing him for the very thing he had been promised. In Potiphar's house, he learned to manage resources. In prison, he learned leadership and wisdom. By the time he was brought before Pharaoh, he was not just a dreamer, he was a man equipped with the skills, character, and faith necessary to lead a nation. The waiting had not been a detour, it had been training for his death. The same is true for us. The waiting season is where God refines us, where He removes the things in us that cannot go into the next season, where He builds endurance, humility, and trust in Him. It is in the waiting that we learn to rely on God and not our own strength. It is in the waiting that our faith is tested, stretched, and strengthened. If God answered every prayer immediately, if He gave us everything we wanted the moment we asked, we would never develop the depth of character needed to sustain the blessing. David was anointed as king as a young man, but he did not step into his reign right away. Instead, he spent years running for his life, hiding in caves, facing betrayals, and enduring hardship. Why? Because God was preparing him. The same man who killed Goliath still needed to be molded into a king. Through the struggles, David learned to trust God in battle, to seek Him in times of uncertainty, and to lead with wisdom and integrity. When he finally took the throne, he was not just a warrior. He was a man after God's own heart, ready for the responsibility of ruling a nation. Abraham and Sarah had to wait for the promised child. Hannah had to wait for Samuel. The Israelites had to wait for the promised land. Even Jesus himself spent 30 years in preparation before stepping into his public ministry. Waiting is not a punishment, it is a process. God is more interested in who we are becoming than in simply giving us what we desire. He knows what is ahead, and he knows what we need to be ready for it. The waiting season is also where God teaches us obedience and trust. When the answer doesn't come right away, we have a choice. Will we continue to trust God, or will we try to make things happen in our own way? Abraham and Sarah grew impatient and tried to force God's promise by having a child through Hagar. But that decision brought heartache and conflict. When we rush ahead of God, we may get something, but it won't be the fullness of what he intended for us. True faith is trusting that God knows best, even when we do not understand the delay. In the waiting, God also tests our motives. Do we love him for who he is, or do we only seek him for what he can give us? Do we trust his plan, or are we only following him for the blessings? The waiting reveals our hearts. It shows us what we truly believe about God and whether we will remain faithful even when things don't happen on our timeline. God's preparation often happens in hidden places. Joseph was in a prison, David was in caves, Moses was in the wilderness. Jesus spent years in obscurity before his public ministry. Just because no one sees what God is doing in you right now does not mean that nothing is happening. The unseen preparation is just as important as the visible breakthrough. God is working in the depths of your heart, refining your character, increasing your faith, and shaping you for what is ahead. Every great move of God is preceded by a season of preparation. The waiting is not about sitting still. It is about being actively shaped by God. It is about surrendering to his process, trusting his timing, and allowing him to do the deep work in us that will sustain the blessing when it finally arrives. We may not understand it in the moment, but one day we will look back and realize that every delay had a purpose. Every closed door was for our good, and every waiting season was an essential part of God's greater plan. There are moments in life when we feel like we are standing on the edge of a breakthrough, but nothing seems to be changing. We pray, we wait, we believe, yet day after day, everything looks the same. The weight of disappointment, the frustration of delays, and the uncertainty of when things will turn around can feel overwhelming. But what we often forget is that no matter how long the waiting has been, no matter how impossible the situation seems, everything can change in an instant when God moves. God is not bound by human limitations. He is not restricted by time, circumstances, or impossibilities. When he speaks, mountains move. When he acts, doors open that no one can shut. A moment in his presence can transform years of struggle. A single word from him can bring healing, restoration, and provision beyond anything we could have imagined. What seemed impossible for years can shift in a single day, a single moment, because when God's appointed time comes, nothing can stand in his way. In the Bible, we see this truth over and over again. Joseph spent years in prison, falsely accused and forgotten. He had no idea when or if his situation would ever change. But then, in one moment, everything turned around. Pharaoh had a dream that no one could interpret, and suddenly Joseph was remembered. He was taken from the prison and brought before Pharaoh, and within a single day, he was promoted from a prisoner to the second most powerful man in Egypt. Years of waiting, years of hardship, and yet when God's timing arrived, it all changed in an instant. The same happened for the Israelites when they were enslaved in Egypt. For generations, they cried out to God for deliverance. Their suffering continued, and it may have seemed like nothing would ever change. But then, in one night, everything shifted. The Passover came, and with it, their breakthrough. What had seemed like an unending season of bondage ended in a single moment as Pharaoh let them go. They walked out of Egypt as free people, because when God moves, no force of darkness, no human power, no obstacle can stand against him. Think about Bartimaeus, the blind beggar who sat by the roadside calling out to Jesus. He had lived in darkness for years, dependent on others, overlooked by society. But one encounter with Jesus changed everything. In a single moment, his sight was restored. He went from being a beggar to a man who could see, a man who had a new future. His years of suffering ended in an instant because he held on to faith and did not give up. The woman with the issue of blood had suffered for 12 long years. She had spent everything she had trying to find a cure, but nothing worked. She was weak, broken, and desperate. But when she reached out in faith and touched the hem of Jesus' garment, her healing came immediately. In one moment, everything changed. What doctors could not do, what money could not fix, what years of effort could not resolve, God did in an instant. Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. His family had lost hope. The people around them believed it was over. But Jesus arrived, stood in front of the tomb, and called his name. And in an instant, life returned to a body that had been dead. Lazarus walked out of the grave because when God's timing comes, even death has to bow. There are situations in our lives where we feel like nothing is happening, but God is setting things up for the right moment. Just because we do not see movement does not mean he is not working. Sometimes the breakthrough takes time because God is aligning things in a way that will bring the greatest impact. Sometimes he allows us to wait so that when the breakthrough comes, we will know without a doubt that it was his hand at work. We may be one prayer away from the answer we have been waiting for. We may be one act of obedience away from stepping into the promise. We may be closer than we think to the moment when everything shifts. That is why we cannot give up. The enemy wants us to stop believing just before the breakthrough happens. He wants us to let go right before the promise is fulfilled. But if we hold on, if we remain faithful, if we trust God even when we do not see a way, we will witness his power in ways beyond our imagination. God's timing is not like ours. He may not always come when we expect, but he is never late. And when he moves swiftly. In one moment, he can open a door that has been closed for years. In one moment, he can bring a breakthrough that changes everything. He can heal a body, restore a marriage, break an addiction, and turn a life around in an instant. It does not matter how long the struggle has been. It does not matter how deep the pain has felt. It does not matter how impossible the situation appears. When God's appointed time arrives, nothing can stop what he is about to do. One encounter with him can shift everything. One moment in his presence can rewrite the story. One divine intervention can take what the enemy meant for evil and turn it around for good. The waiting may be long, the nights may be dark, and the journey may be hard, but the breakthrough is coming. And when it comes, it will happen in an instant because that is the power of our God. Faith is not just believing when things are easy. Faith is holding on when everything around us tells us to let go. It is trusting in God's promises, even when there is no evidence in sight. It is standing firm when the world says to give up. Faith is not a feeling. It is a decision, a choice to believe in what God has spoken, despite what we see, despite what we feel, despite how long we have waited. And the truth is, faith is not just about starting strong. It is about enduring until the fulfillment comes. Endurance is what keeps us going when the road is long, when the answer is delayed, when the breakthrough seems far away. It is what separates those who receive God's promises from those who walk away too soon. Many people begin with faith, but when the journey becomes difficult, when the waiting stretches on longer than expected, when obstacles arise and disappointments come, they start to waver. But endurance says, I will not quit. I will not turn back. I will hold on no matter how long it takes because I trust that God is faithful. The Bible is filled with stories of people who had to endure before they saw the fulfillment of God's promises. Abraham was given a promise that he would be the father of many nations, but he and Sarah waited years before Isaac was born. There were times they struggled, times they doubted, times they tried to take matters into their own hands, but in the end, they saw God's word come to pass. If they had given up, they would have missed the blessing. Noah was commanded to build an ark when there was no sign of rain. Year after year, he built, he waited, he endured the ridicule of those who did not understand. But the flood came at the appointed time, and because he had the faith to obey and the endurance to see it through, he and his family were saved. Joseph endured betrayal, slavery, false accusations, and years of imprisonment, but he held on. He could have become bitter. He could have turned away from God. He could have decided that the dream was never going to happen. But he remained faithful, and when the time was right, God elevated him to a position of power in Egypt. If he had let go of his faith during the difficult years, he would have never stepped into the fulfillment of his destiny. Moses led the Israelites through the wilderness, and many of them did not endure. They complained, they doubted, they turned away from God. And because of their lack of faith and endurance, They never entered the promised land, but Joshua and Caleb held on. They believed when others doubted. They endured when others gave up, and because of that, they saw the fulfillment of God's promise. Jesus himself demonstrated perfect faith and endurance. He knew the cross was before him, but he did not turn back. He endured the pain, the rejection, the suffering, because he saw beyond the moment. He saw the joy set before him. He knew that through his endurance, salvation would come to the world. And because he did not give up, the greatest victory in history was accomplished. Faith and endurance go hand in hand. Faith gets us started, but endurance keeps us going. Faith believes in the promise, but endurance walks through the trials to reach it. Faith declares, God will do it, but endurance says, I will wait until he does. Without endurance, we risk giving up right before the breakthrough. Without endurance, we settle for less than God's best. Without endurance, we miss the blessing that is waiting on the other side of the struggle. Sometimes the hardest part of faith is simply continuing to believe when nothing seems to be changing. We pray and see no results. We knock on doors that remain closed. We wait, and the waiting feels endless. But this is where endurance is formed. This is where faith is refined. It is in these moments that we make the decision to trust God, not based on what we see, but based on who he is. And the truth is, he is always faithful. He never breaks his promises. He never fails. He never forgets. If he said it, he will do it. The enemy wants us to grow weary. He wants us to let go of our faith just before the fulfillment comes. He knows that if he can convince us to stop trusting, to stop praying, to stop believing, then we will never see the victory that God has in store for us. But those who endure, those who hold on, those who refuse to give up, will see the goodness of God in their lives. God has not forgotten what he promised you. He has not abandoned you in the waiting. He is working even when you do not see it. He is preparing even when it feels like nothing is happening. Every delay has a purpose. Every struggle is shaping you. Every moment of endurance is strengthening your faith. And when the time is right, the fulfillment will come. The door will open. The breakthrough will happen. The promise will be fulfilled. Faith and endurance are the keys to receiving everything that God has in store. It may not come when we expect. It may not happen the way we imagine, but it will come. And when it does, we will realize that every tear, every prayer, every moment of waiting was worth it. Because God never fails, and those who endure to the end will see his faithfulness in ways beyond their greatest expectations. So don't give up. Don't lose hope. Don't stop believing. Hold on, because God is faithful. Hold on, because your miracle is closer than you think. Hold on, because you are not forgotten. The waiting is not forever. The night will not last always. The sun will rise, the doors will open, and the promise will be fulfilled. One day you will look back and say, now I see why God made me wait. Now I understand what he was doing all along. Now I see that his plan was so much greater than mine. But for now, while you wait, trust him. Worship in the waiting. Keep praying. Keep believing. Keep expecting. And when the moment comes, when his perfect timing is revealed, you will stand in awe and say, look what the Lord has done.